one of the things that's really hard about college is it's like homesickness is real. Adjustment disorder is real. Like these are very real things. Like sharing space with someone else is really hard. Eating 3 meals is hard. If you've got mild social anxiety, getting to the cafeteria or the dining hall is really tough. Who am I going to sit with? Where am I going to eat? I don't like eating in front of people.
The college years are full of change, but for many students, that transition also comes with rising anxiety, burnout, and struggles that often go unrecognized. Why does mental health tend to dip during this stage of life? And how can students, families, and educators work together to create more supportive systems, not just in college, but long before? Dr. Christopher Willard is a clinical psychologist, author of more than 20 books, and a faculty member at Harvard Medical School. He's here to talk about supporting mental health through major life transitions and why feelings really are a lot like farts. That's straight ahead on episode 279. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
This time of year always reminds me how much energy teachers put into just getting ready for the school year. But honestly, one of the things that tends to get overlooked is making sure teachers actually have the tools they need to support their neurodivergent kids, especially those twice exceptional kids who are both gifted and struggling at the same time, or those kids with dyslexia who are struggling so hard to keep up that people don't even realize they're struggling. That's really kind of the reason we put together the courses over at Neurodiversity University. Whether you're a teacher who just wants to learn on your own, or your whole district is looking for PD options for neurodivergent kids, we've got stuff that's actually useful, like practical strategies for supporting 2E students, or a Foundations of Dyslexia course that's really just the basics every teacher should know. So if you're thinking about ways to kick off the year with some professional learning that's actually helpful, head over to Neurodiversity University at neurodiversity.university and check it out. There's a link in the show notes if you need it. Okay, Chris Willard is here next.
On a recent episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Humans are creatures who need to be co-regulated. Again, I've, at this stage of my life, have a relatively resilient stress response system. I still need oodles and oodles of co-regulation. Some of it I don't even notice. It's just like infused in my life. But when I'm upset, when I'm stressed out, I turn to my people for help or for support. So co-regulation is a human experience that we need, from before we're born until, our last breaths.
That's episode 254, Unraveling the Mysteries of Baffling Behaviors. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Christopher Willard. Chris is a clinical psychologist, an author, and Harvard Medical School faculty member whose work has reached audiences around the world. He's spoken in over 40 countries and at 2 TEDx events, and he's written over more than 20 books on mental health and mindfulness, ranging from guides like Growing Up Mindful to playful, resonant titles like Feelings Are Like Farts, which, by the way, is every bit as brilliant as it is hilarious. His new book, College Mental Health 101, speaks to a topic that feels more relevant than ever. Chris, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Oh my gosh, it's great to be here. Great to be back and continue our conversations that we have offline too. So this is great.
I had kind of just gotten to know you a little bit when we did our last episode. And then since then, we've had more opportunities to chat. But I'm super happy to have you back. Before we dive too deep into the heavy stuff, because I really love the range of your work, in addition to this book on mental health that we're going to talk about. The newly released Feelings Are Like Farts book is just hilarious. I love it. I keep telling people about it because I think it's so fun. And it's totally spot on for helping kids understand emotion. So we're going to come back to that in a bit. But I would love to just go back a little bit and hear about your college experience, because I feel like that maybe has some relevance to this topic and how that experience shaped where you are now as far as how you support educators and young adults in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it felt so beautifully kind of poetic to be able to write this book 20 some years after I finally graduated from college, which ended up taking me 6 years because of my own challenges. I went off to college feeling excited and I would say very well prepared academically, but just totally underprepared for the lack of structure, the just kind of other sorts of changes and challenges that exist when one goes off to college, facing some of my own mental health challenges, addiction challenges for the first time, and really getting hit hard in terms of the lack of structure with my own executive function challenges and ADHD and that kind of thing. That just really kind of sunk me and led to a few crises and a couple of years off trying to figure out what was going on with myself. And then getting back to school, kind of pulling a lot of things together, getting a lot of help along the way, feeling incredibly grateful. This is in like the late 90s, early 2000s. My mom was a psychologist, so I also feel just so lucky that she knew what to look for, what resources to connect me with, having a lot of privilege on that front. And so I was able to get back to school and finish. And then I worked as a teacher for a while and then went back to school for clinical psych with the hope that I could work with college students, university students, partly out of my own kind of painful experience, but it also is just a really fun age group to work with. I worked for many years at a university in their counseling center. I still teach at a university. I'm affiliated with a few. And I just love working with that age. And again, I think partly out of my own experience, and I don't want to, project too much of my own stuff onto whoever it is I work with and meet with, but it is just such a fun age. There's a lot to be done in terms of it is statistically when a lot of mental health challenges start. That's, more genetics in many ways, but also just these other big questions of like, who am I? How do I manage myself? Who do I want to be? What's happening as I get away from my family? These kinds of questions about, this beautiful in-between space of adulthood and childhood. Although certainly when I was in college, I felt like I was a grown-up, but I kind of joke, college is all the rights of adulthood with not too many of the responsibilities. And that's kind of a big gap there to figure out how to fill. But yeah, I had a really hard time. And so it just feels wonderful that I get to write this book, talk to students, and another colleague who I wrote the book with also had some ups and downs. In fact, all three of us did. We actually wanted the bio on the back to have our GPAs because they're all such a disaster. So it's like, I don't know, 2 point something for me. I think I had the lowest of the three of us, but then, here we are. We've all been incredibly successful. Blaze is an MD and travels the world and, leads one of the most kind of influential clinics and has written a ton of books. My friend Chelsea, who also we wrote the book with, is doing incredible work helping young people. And so it can be a hard time. And, it's not always the best years of your life. It wasn't really for me, but, it doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning.
I think everybody can look back on that time in their life, regardless of whether or not they attended college or not. It is just a really important developmental stage. I've heard people refer to college as the halfway house to adulthood, where it's like kind of like you said, that in-between stage. Yeah. And I think that's so relevant. And I agree. It's like you're independent, but also like just trying to figure things out. And you kind of mentioned specifically about how this is a time in life when there are a lot of mental health concerns that do rise to the surface. Mm-hmm. Is that something that is getting worse, this rise in mental health concerns, I think, in general with young people? Is there something that's changing or contributing to that shift, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a real kind of chicken and egg that a lot of folks that are working with young people of all ages, are asking, is it that we're better at diagnosing, or is it that there's more going on? I think it's probably a little bit of both. And I think in some ways we're also over-diagnosing in ways that are maybe not always necessarily all that helpful. We also see kids self-diagnosing. In fact, part of the motivation for writing the book was like that there's just one of the things about mental health in recent years is that stigma has just gone down across the board. Like, and also like around the world, stigma has gone down. Like I'm, in like Hong Kong, I'm in, Egypt, I'm talking to teenagers, and they're just very frank and upfront about their mental health challenges, depression, anxiety. And and I actually want to thank social media for destigmatizing mental health. At the same time, there's been this massive amount of misinformation about mental health and mental illness. And in fact, I saw something about like just a couple of days ago, like that TikTok, like 80% of the messaging about mental health issues on TikTok is not good information. And so part of what we wanted to do was like create like a source that's actually like this book can be, hopefully just a good resource for people about like, well, what really is depression and how is that not like sadness? And, like what really is a symptom? I feel like there's this phenomenon online of, the sort of joke I have is like, the self-diagnosis of like, if you ever farted in the shower, it means you have like childhood trauma. If you've ever, been like slightly anxious at a party, you must have ADHD and social anxiety and be on the spectrum. And it's like, no, like let's slow way down here.
Right.
And so we wanted to create something that was actually like, here's actually a scientifically based resource by people who work at a medical school, by people who are experts, where we talk to other experts and we talk to students and their families just to kind of give a sense of like, what is really happening. So I think it's a little bit of all of this. Social media has made mental health worse. It has exacerbated misinformation about mental health. The world is more stressful. The pandemic has really contributed to a lot of the crisis. That bubble is still kind of coming up, in the ages, in college, getting to college, all of that, and I think that's important to recognize. And there's more understanding of mental health. And we have this like swing toward certain diagnoses are trendy, and I do think there's good things about when a diagnosis gets trendy. Like right now, a lot of neurodivergence is trendy, and that's great because it's giving us, helping open our eyes to that. At the same time, one of the challenges is that it can then overshadow things. It's like, yes, it looks like ADHD, but also we're maybe missing out on the depression that's co-occurring at the same time. So I think learning how to parse out a little bit, and when there's a swing toward a trendy diagnosis, again, we get more information, but at the same time, it can overshadow things. But overall, I think it's good that we're just having more of these conversations and clarifying what is ADHD, what is being on the spectrum, what is depression, what is anxiety, how are these different, how do they look the same? And that's really hard. And I think that's really hard for young people these days to sort out as well, when just like things are hard. Like, what is it? I want a diagnosis.
Yeah, they want to know. And so they seek out these labels or these diagnoses. And it is interesting. You mentioned like in the neurodiversity community, a big emphasis and push in that community is to depathologize and destigmatize so many of these different labels. But conversely, what I kind of was thinking about as you were sharing that, what is coming out of that is that people are then pathologizing normal things, normal
Right.
emotions. Like it's like we overshot a little bit too far with some of it.
And how do we tease out both? Feeling like I can't focus because everyone feels like they can't focus and everyone procrastinates to some extent, but also it doesn't mean childhood trauma, doesn't necessarily mean ADHD, it doesn't necessarily, but if it is that, then how do we work with that understanding of that diagnosis to help with your particular unique brand of procrastination or your unique struggle that someone on the spectrum might have with social interactions? And that's really important to tease out. So it's kind of a both and.
Actually, kind of building on that a little bit and just recognizing, as you were saying, college really is stressful. That's really just part of the deal. But how do we actually help students recognize when their stress crosses that line into something like clinical anxiety or depression? They have this insight. How do we help them try to figure that out in a way that's both realistic and helpful?
Yeah, and I think also as parents, as caregivers, as clinicians, as people that work with, live with, get text messages from young people, I think there's also this sort of like, how do we validate the really strong discomfort the really strong, uncomfortable feelings that are happening without over-pathologizing them? How do we validate? Well, also saying, I know you can do this. I know you got this. Like, I know you've got the resources. I really always kind of appreciate the like biopsychosocial model. Like, what are you, that can make things worse. It can make things better. And so I remember when I worked at Tufts University for a while in their counseling center, and kind of joking with the supervisor. I was like, I kind of feel like half these kids that come in, if I tell them to like get some sleep and like eat 3 meals a day, get some exercise, like they'll mostly be better. But I feel like I just their grandmother saying that, and why would they listen to me? And my supervisor was like, you're probably not entirely wrong. But the thing is, you're not their grandmother, you're their therapist. So they might actually listen to you.
Exactly.
And I think one of the things that's really hard about college is it's like homesickness is real. Adjustment disorder is real. Like these are very real things. Like sharing space with someone else is really hard. Eating 3 meals is hard. If you've got mild social anxiety, getting to the cafeteria, the dining hall is really tough. Who am I going to sit with? Where am I going to eat? I don't like eating in front of people. What am I going to eat? If you've got mild executive function challenges, you might forget to eat altogether, especially if you're taking a stimulant med. If you've got depression, then pulling yourself out of bed and getting to class, and getting to the dining hall is going to be really hard. And that's just eating, If no one's telling you to wake up at a reasonable time or go to bed at a reasonable time, you're not going to. And one of the things that's really hard is like not a lot of kids who I see struggle are like out there partying. It's just like, there's always someone hanging out. There's always someone to play video games with in the lounge at 3 a.m. There's always someone who's down to have a cool philosophical conversation with that's probably more interesting than doing your reading. And it's those temptations that actually are what really trip up kids, especially kids with some executive function deficits or even some mild mental health challenges that are really hard to track. And so I do feel like, really trying to teach some kids about the basics of self-care, like get 3 meals a day, try to get 8-ish hours, approximately same time to bed and waking up. Like, again, that is so hard. College is like its own time zone. I kind of joke about sometimes, but like to do that a little bit can actually really then provide a foundation. And then you can start to see a little bit, well, is there really anxiety going on? Is there depression going on? Is there other stuff going on? One of the things we tried to do in the book was really we have a sort of like a diagnostic section in the back, which is not, you're trying to stay away from self-diagnosis, but really like, what do these things look like? Like not just, feeling sad, but like, are you really not getting yourself to class? Not just feeling socially anxious, because we all feel anxious at a party, especially with new people, and if we haven't had 3 beers or something like that, that's going to happen. But like, are you really avoiding things, because of that anxiety? And that's really something that we want to work with and look at in a different way. So trying to get a little bit deeper behind some of that stuff that just is in the way when you're away from home, when you're with other young people, when there's not a lot of structure to your life. How do these things manifest? What do they look like? And again, sort of this idea of like adjustment disorder is real. It is a real diagnosis. And we don't want to like, it can feel so invalidating to be like, I feel terrible. I just have adjustment disorder. Right. And a lot of our clients might pull for like a sort of, bigger, kind of more powerful diagnosis in some ways. But like reminding people that maybe there's a bigger pathology and maybe like things are really uncomfortable and both really stink and both can really be treated with some changes that you make in your lifestyle and maybe some medication and maybe some kind of cognitive reframing or maybe some, finding ways to, find some tools to organize yourself or to push yourself can be really powerful. And we don't have to belittle anybody or get into an arms race about who's got the most intense diagnosis either, which can be something that kind of happens at that age. And I don't want to sound patronizing about it, but I think that can be a bit of a thing that some kids can get stuck on.
Just for folks who might not know, can you elaborate a little bit on what exactly adjustment disorder is?
Is sort of like some anxiety, some depression, some symptoms. It's a little bit of a catch-all, but it's like difficulty adjusting to a change. And going to a college is a huge change. Not being around your old friends, not being around your old family, New academic challenges is a big enough change. Breaking up with your high school boyfriend or girlfriend is a real change. Leaving, a study abroad program to come back for your senior year is a big enough change. Like, it's just hard to adjust to new circumstances that cause stress and distress.
Yeah, we use that diagnosis frequently in our office, primarily because, especially when people first come in, because sometimes there is that life change that has kind of been the primary catalyst for what has initiated them to come in. And then over time, I think one of the other diagnostic pieces of the adjustment disorder basically is that usually it resolves itself after some amount of time, I think 6 months, unless that transition or that adjustment period is still ongoing. And so then it's like if it is prolonged, then maybe we kind of look at some of those other labels if we haven't been able to figure out some coping skills and strategies. And I feel like that also is just a good tool, at least as clinicians, for us to make sure we aren't just jumping on a label too quickly.
It's actually interesting. I was talking to someone recently who, everything is supposed to be, like confidential and all of that. And someone I was talking to recently said that they were applying for life insurance and a diagnosis from when they were like in college, like came back to bite them on that. And they were like, oh man, so I also do feel like it's important as those of us that are clinicians, or even that are parents advocating or caregivers advocating for kids, to not jump to a kind of bigger sounding diagnosis. To give people the diagnosis that fits, of course, but like it can have consequences in some ways down the road that are unfair, but that are real.
As far as like systemic supports, what are things that are working that colleges are doing to support students? And what are the areas where you feel like, okay, this is an area that we could really do better to support our students?
Yeah. Colleges are throwing so many resources at kids with mental health issues. One of the universities I worked at, I think there was 11 of us on staff. I just got asked to go give a talk there, and they said they now have 24 people on staff. And I was like, the school didn't get twice as big. And I know kids at that school are also still struggling to get an appointment. So, there is in some ways more demand, which is good. The other thing I want to say about sort of the changes, one of the things that's been great is we've figured out how to support kids through medication and therapy in high school who might otherwise have not made it through high school or made it to college. So part of what we're seeing also in terms of, more diagnoses and more kids needing support in college is kids who wouldn't have ever made it through high school now can make it through high school and now can get to college, but they need a lot of supports in place. And so universities are often providing those. Which is good. But I think there's a lot of kids that are still falling through the cracks. I think the kids that are in the families that are often the squeaky wheel, who often are, kids with other privileges, are getting those appointments. Kids who are first generation, kids from, certain marginalized communities, kids from communities where there is still a fair amount of stigma around mental health issues are not getting in the door, not getting the supports that they need. Kids who are first generation, kids who are, not kind of acculturated in other ways to a therapy world don't know that you can take an incomplete and withdraw. They don't know oftentimes that extensions can be asked for from professors, although I really want to just say a word of caution about asking for extensions and incompletes. But some of these things, they don't know that you can take a leave of absence when you're failing your classes and maybe get your transcript wiped, and they end up going into the failing out, into the academic probation bucket, not knowing that maybe there's a mental health issue, attentional issue, an executive function issue that's underlying what some of their struggles are. So, those kids I feel like are particularly not being reached. The other thing I think that we can do a better job of that more schools are doing is like, I interviewed this student from Wesleyan, which is where I went. I happened to be down, got connected with this really cool kid. But he was an athlete. He was actually a first generation college student. He was a basketball player. And he also talked about being the mental health liaison for the NESCAC, which is like the New England Small Colleges Athletic Conference, I guess. But it's like, oh, that is so cool. Like, because especially at some of these schools, like the kids are spending more time with their coaches and teams than they are with roommates and certainly with professors. Yeah. And so can we educate coaches? Can, maybe, sports psychologists also be doing a little screening around mental health? Can we be reaching out to the kind of identity communities, the Latinx house, the, African-American Resource Center, other kinds of places, cultural houses and cultural centers to train them with mental health? Can we actually get counselors into those places? One thing that drove me nuts was feeling like, well, we're in this little corner of campus and that actually we're doing that because of, sort of stigma, but actually then kids are sort of like having to feel like there should be more stigma. And what if actually one day a week we had a counselor have an office hours in the library, or have office hours in the campus center, or have office hours in the cultural centers to drop by, as well as what if we did more training in those communities themselves and got into the dorms and had drop-in hours. And I think more schools are doing this, which is good. But I think what's happened for a lot of schools, one of the pieces of resistance I've faced in that is, well, then we're going to get more referrals. And it's like, how do we get the right referrals in some ways too? And it's like, well, we can't handle advertising, then we'll be overwhelmed. And that's true. That's a real catch-22. But also, how do we help the higher functioning kids out the door? How do we, get better at saying no to the squeaky wheels who can afford to go off campus for their treatment? How do we, get a better Rolodex of local providers and things like that? So all of these, I think, are a big part of it. But it's a real challenge. It's a systemic issue. It's not just on college campuses. Anyone that's tried to find a referral for their high school kid. And actually, the book is a lot about how do you think about applying to schools when you're in high school, but trying to get a therapist for your high school kid is really hard. Trying to get medication for, if you need a stimulant is next to impossible for your high school kid. It's a larger systemic issue than just colleges, but it's particularly acute in those places for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was reflecting as you were sharing about that, and I was just thinking back on my own college experience. And one of the most basic things in so many venues that we can do to support kids is giving really clear, explicit instructions. I don't think I knew until I went to my master's program what office hours meant.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a time that you could drop in and ask a question. I would get a syllabus from every class, and every professor would have their office hours listed, but I didn't know what that really meant.
Right.
I mean, I had parents who went to college. You would think that I would have the privilege of having some supports, but no one explained it to me, and I just didn't know.
Yeah.
And we just forget about those little gaps. And what a quick little thing it would be for a professor to make sure to say, just in every class, even if it's your fourth year, seniors getting ready to graduate, these are my office hours. Here is how you can use those. And just being really clear about that.
No, I love this because I also my parents have advancst degrees. My mom wanted to be a professor. What is an office hour?
Yeah.
What does that mean? And then you think about a kid without that sort of acculturation that I had, or, a first gen kid or so, all of that. But some of those little things are just, it's its own vocabulary, it's its own culture, the world of higher ed to navigate for a lot of our kids.
Well, and part of it is when you're in that world, you don't think about those things because you know what it is. So you forget that you need to be explicit about it. You forget that you need to explain it. And just taking that time to be really intentional and curious about that and talking to students and just developing those systems can make such a big difference in the long run.
Yeah.
As we're getting a little short on time, I want to make sure we have a chance to circle back to your book, Feelings Are Like Farts, because as I mentioned, I laugh every time I think about it because it is such a perfect analogy. I just really appreciate it, but also it's got that hook, that buy-in that I know kids will love. It's just this really smart, accessible metaphor for helping kids understand emotional expression. And I love how you kind of build in this humor and irreverence in how we talk about feelings. And I would just love to get some of your insights on how you're trying to communicate with kids and get their buy-in and express this in ways that maybe get their interest piqued.
So this started during the pandemic. I think 2021, my friend, or maybe 2020, my friend texted me and said, my daughter just said feelings are like farts. We should write a book. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cute. And then I didn't really think about it. And then a month later, I was like, oh my God, that is such a good idea.
Yeah.
And we ended up I remember vividly taking a nature walk with the kids because we're, it's the pandemic, and furiously, furtively texting with this friend, all these sort of fart joke, feeling joke, they can be silent, but they're never deadly. And if they hurt, you should talk to an adult you trust. And you don't want to have them, certain places you don't want to have them, an elevator or an airplane. And these kinds of things. And so I was not really paying attention to my nature walk with the kids. And but we wrote it, in like a few minutes over text. We sent it out. I've never had a bidding war for any of my books. We had a 6 publishing house bidding war. Like,
wow.
I got the biggest advance for any book I've ever written. And it's like a, 28-page book about farts. And then it took 4 years of like changing publishers, and this person left this publishing house, and oh my gosh, and this and that, and illustrators. And it finally came out. But it has been so fun. I do feel like, especially for boys who maybe, I don't want to be totally gendered here, but there are some kids who maybe find this book a little funnier, a little bit of a better metaphor than others. But just like, they like linger, but they never last. And, they kind of have a way of following you around, even when you try to, walk away and leave them behind. You really can't escape. And so it was just so much fun. And I'm actually kind of toying with the idea of like writing almost like a grown-up version, like a 3-page chapter on, why you should talk to someone you trust, or a 3-page chapter on they can be silent, but they're never deadly. It was a blast to write, and it's been really fun to kind of take it around and read it to kids. And my own kids are slightly mortified about it. They loved it when it first came out, and now that they're older, they're like, my son was like, yeah, no, actually, don't put me in the dedication. Like, because it's been like 4 years since we wrote the book. So when he was 6, he was like, yeah, awesome, put me in the dedication. And then like a year ago, when they're finalizing the edits, they're like, do you want the dedication to both kids? And I checked my son, I was like, yeah, no, actually take me out.
That's so funny.
I know, right?
How old are your kids now?
They are 7 and 10.
Oh my gosh, they're already embarrassed by you. Man.
I know.
It's only going to get worse for them.
I'm like, there's just because they're so mature that they're so mortified by me. But
that's so funny. Chris, I love chatting with you, and I'm so glad we had a chance to have this conversation. Before we wrap up, I've just one last question for you. Mm-hmm. So if you were talking to a young adult who's just entering college and they're experiencing the stress of this huge transition, what's the one thing you would want them to know? What's one thing that you would really like to say to them?
I mean, honestly, I'm kind of ticked off that Oxford didn't let us put our GPAs in our bios. Maybe it would have ruined our credibility. But like all of us adults who've had, success, it's like so few of us ever had like a clear pathway through. One thing I know I found helpful was my parents. One thing that they did was kind of connect me with some of their family, some of our family friends who like, so-and-so back in the 60s had a, what they called back then, a nervous breakdown, whatever that means, and had to take a year off from college. Or, this friend of the family, struggled and took a year or two off. Nothing wrong with that. And they figured out their path later. Like hearing those stories was really helpful and empowering for me. Mm-hmm. And my story is kind of, it's like, 6 years to barely get through undergrad and then like 4 years through grad school. Like who knew, right? But like that it can take time and that there's also really one thing I heard again and again that I had a hard time with was that there's no rush. Yeah. I really felt, and I think we're wired at that age for FOMO. And I felt like I'm going to miss out on this, I'm going to miss out on that, and my friends will graduate. And by the time I went back, I made some amazing new friends. And they're actually who I'm in touch with, is the people I went back with for my senior year. Very few of the people, who I was close with those first 3 years. And it's like, it is always there. And some of the people we interviewed, a wonderful dean who's an old friend of mine from Penn, talked about like, there's no rush. Education is something to be savored, not something to be endured. So gap years before school, gap years during school, nothing wrong with these things. Take your time, savor it. Don't just try to endure it and grind it out. And I really love that advice too.
Dr. Chris Willard, author of College Mental Health 101 and the children's book Feelings Are Like Farts. I said it without laughing. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. This has been great and so nice to chat.
If there's one thing that stands out from this conversation, it's that recognizing and addressing mental health struggles shouldn't wait until there's a crisis. College students often don't realize when their stress or anxiety has crossed a line, and too often they've never been taught how to tune into those internal signals in the first place. That's where the adults in their lives can make a huge difference. By modeling these conversations early, By normalizing rest, boundaries, and asking for help, we can give people the tools they need long before they face those challenges on their own. Mental health should never feel like a last resort. It should be part of everyday life. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Dr. Chris Willard, who has helped make it cool to speak openly about flatulation, thus making my parenting style seem like genius. If you'd like to know more about him and about his new book, Feelings Are Like Farts, check out the show notes or episode page. Also, are you a member of our Facebook group? Have you followed us on Blue Sky? Do you see our Instagram content? Look for links in the show notes, and let's link. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Farts. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance,